The dying man's fingers clawed at the rocky ground, leaving bloody streaks on the stone as his life ebbed away with each labored breath. Jed Morrison had seen death before too many times during his cavalry days, but something about this man's desperate urgency made his skin crawl. The stranger's pale blue eyes locked onto Yet's face with the intensity of a man who knew his time was measured in heartbeats. It had started as just another day of drifting through the badlands with Rustler, picking his way through the maze of red rock formations and dry creek beds that could swallow a man whole. Jed had been following the old freight trail toward what he hoped might be work at a cattle operation near the Colorado border, his weathered hands loose on the reins, his mind occupied with the familiar concerns of a man whose money was running thin and whose prospects seemed as barren as the landscape around him. At 32, Jed had the lean build of someone who'd known hard work and harder times. His face was bronzed by sun and wind, eyes the color of winter sky beneath the brim of his worn hat. He'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground, drifting from job to job across the frontier, breaking horses here, driving cattle there, always moving, never settling. The ache in his bones that came with sleeping on hard ground was getting worse, and he was beginning to feel the weight of too many uncertain tomorrows. Rustler, his chestnut gelding, had been his only constant companion for 8 years longer than any human relationship Jed had managed to maintain. The horse was no beauty by ranch standards, with a white blaze down his face and 3 white socks, but he had intelligence in his dark eyes and an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it showed itself. During Yet's cavalry days, when they'd patrolled the frontier looking for hostile Indians and army deserters, Rustler's instincts had saved his life more times than he could count. The badlands stretched endlessly in all directions that afternoon, a desolate expanse of cracked earth and scattered rocks under a sun that hung like a blood-red coin in the western sky. The silence was complete, except for the steady rhythm of Rustler's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. It was the kind of country that could drive a man mad with its emptiness, or kill him with its indifference. As the afternoon wore on, Rustler began to act strangely. First, it was just a twitch of his ears, swiveling toward sounds Jed couldn't hear. Then the horse's gait changed, becoming more alert, more purposeful. His nostrils flared as he tested the wind, and a low whicker escaped his throat. Not fear, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or urgency. When they reached a fork in the Trail 1 path, continuing straight ahead toward their destination, the other veering off into rougher country that led nowhere, civilized Rustler suddenly pulled hard to the right, away from the main trail. "Easy, boy," Jed murmured, tightening his grip on the reins. "That way leads to nothing but trouble." But Rustler fought the bit, tossing his head and dancing sideways. The horse's entire body was tense with purpose, as if he'd caught the scent of something important in the dry desert air. Jed had learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts. In Apache country, during those long patrols through hostile territory, Rustler's senses had often been the difference between coming home alive and becoming another casualty of the frontier wars. "All right," Jed said finally, loosening the reins. "Show me what's got you so worked up." Rustler immediately struck off down the rougher path, picking his way carefully between boulders and jumping the occasional dry wash. They climbed steadily into more broken country, where wind-carved stone pillars rose like ancient sentinels and the air grew thin and cold. The main trail disappeared behind them, swallowed by the maze of canyons and rock formations, and Jed began to wonder if he was making a mistake. This was no place to be caught after dark, especially not alone. The landscape around them was hauntingly beautiful in its desolation. Red sandstone formations twisted into impossible shapes by millions of years of wind and weather, their surfaces painted in shades of crimson and gold by the late afternoon sun. Deep arroyos, cut through the desert. Floor-like scars, their shadowed depths hiding secrets that might never see daylight. It was a place where a man could disappear without a trace, where the bones of the unwary lay bleaching under the relentless sun. After an hour of steady, climbing through increasingly treacherous terrain, Rustler suddenly stopped, his whole body rigid with attention. His ears were pricked forward, and he snorted softly, the sound echoing off the rocks around them like a gunshot in the silence. Jed followed the horse's gaze and saw it a splash of color that didn't belong in the natural landscape. 50 yards ahead, wedged between two large boulders in what looked like a natural shelter, lay a man. Yet's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. In this country, you couldn't be too careful. A man lying alone in the badlands might be hurt, but he might also be bait for an ambush. Jed had seen that trick before, during his army days. Wounded men used as decoys to draw good Samaritans into killing fields where hidden gunmen waited. But as he approached, keeping low and using the rocks for cover, it became clear that this was no trap. The man was alone, and he was dying. He was maybe 50 years old, with graying hair that had once been black and a face that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Blood had soaked through his shirt in two places, his chest and his side. More blood had pooled beneath him on the rocky ground, already beginning to congeal in the desert heat. His breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle against what looked like massive internal injuries. The man's clothes were good quality, but travel-stained, the kind worn by someone who'd been riding hard for days. His gun belt was empty. Either he'd lost his weapon, or someone had taken it from him. Dark stains on his shirt suggested he'd been shot at close range, probably by someone he'd trusted enough to let get near. When Jed knelt beside him, the man's eyes fluttered. Open. They were pale blue, faded like old denim, but still sharp with intelligence and something else, desperation, so intense it was almost palpable. Water, the man whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the rocks. Jed uncapped his canteen and carefully lifted the man's head, letting a few drops trickle between his cracked lips. The water seemed to revive him slightly, and his eyes focused on Yet's face with renewed intensity. Double quotes, you. You're not one of them, the man said, his voice gaining a little strength. One of who? Jed asked, but the man was already reaching inside his blood-soaked vest with a trembling hand. Listen to me, the man gasped, blood flecking his lips as he spoke. My name is Silas Crenshaw. I rode with black-hearted Bart for 15 years, until I got smart. The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Every lawman and honest citizen west of the Mississippi knew about Bart Malloy and his gang. They'd been terrorizing railroad lines and stagecoach routes for the better part of a decade, appearing suddenly like ghosts to strike, and then vanishing into the wilderness. They were legends of violence and greed, responsible for dozens of F's and hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen goods. I tried to get out, Silas continued, his breathing becoming more ragged. But you don't just walk away from Bart. Not when you know what I know. His hand emerged from his vest, clutching something that made Yet's breath catch a key unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was crafted from tarnished silver, with intricate designs worked into the head, strange symbols etched around the edges that looked almost mystical in their complexity. The whole thing had the weight and feel of something very old, very valuable, and very dangerous. Take it, Silas whispered urgently, pressing the key into Yet's palm. The metal was warm from the dying man's body heat, and it seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. The eagle's perch ... in Abilene ... The widow holds the map. What are you talking about? Jed demanded, but he could see that Silas was. fading fast. The man's skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. 15 years. We've been sitting on the biggest score of our lives, Silas gasped, each word clearly a tremendous effort. Union Pacific, gold shipment to Denver. We hit the train outside Hays City in 71. 200,000 in gold eagles. Hidden it away, ... been waiting for things to cool down. Yet's mind reeled at the implications. 200,000. Dollars in gold was more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. It was enough to buy a ranch the size of a small county, enough to live like a king for the rest of his days, enough to never have to worry about where his next meal was coming from, or whether he'd have a roof over his head when winter came. But it was also blood money, stolen from the railroad and probably responsible for the deaths of innocent men. And judging by the bullet holes in Silas Crenshaw, it was also enough to get him killed if the wrong people found out he had this key. Why? Are you telling me this? Jed asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Silas managed a weak smile that was more grimace than grin. Because you're not them. And because a dying man needs to square things with somebody. I killed men for that gold, friend. Good men. Railroad guards just doing their jobs. It's been eating at me, ... eating at me for years. The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Jed had always prided himself on being a man who lived by a code, who didn't take what wasn't his, and who tried to help rather than harm. Now he was being offered a fortune built on the blood of innocent men, handed to him by one of the killers himself. Where is it? Where's the gold? He found himself asking, despite his moral reservations. The key, the widow in Abilene ... She doesn't know what she's got. The eagle's perch. Silas's voice was getting weaker, each word a struggle against the approaching darkness. But be careful. Bart's been hunting me for 2 years. He knows I took something when I left. He'll kill anyone who gets in his way. The sound that made Yet's blood turn to ice water came from somewhere behind him, a distant echo of hoofbeats on stone, bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. Multiple horses, moving fast, coming from the direction of the main trail. Even as Silas Crenshaw lay dying in his arms, his killers were closing in. Promise me something, Silas, whispered with what was clearly his last breath. The railroad guard, young man with a family. His name was Thomas Mackenzie. His daughter, if you find the gold, see that she gets something. Please. Before Jed could answer, Silas Crenshaw's eyes went blank and stared sightlessly at the darkening sky. The silver key seemed to burn like a coal. In Yet's pawn, but there was no time to process what had just happened. No time to consider the moral implications of the choice that had been thrust upon him. Because the hoofbeats were getting closer, and he could hear voices hard, angry voices calling out commands in the distance. Jed sprinted back to where Rustler waited, the chestnut gelding's ears already pricked forward with alarm. The horse seemed to understand that their lives had just taken a very dangerous turn, and he was already dancing nervously, ready to run at the first command. Easy, boy, Jed murmured as he swung into the saddle, but his voice was tight with barely controlled. Panic. We've got trouble coming, and it's the kind that shoots first and asks questions later. He'd barely gotten settled when he saw them. 3 riders silhouetted against the last light of day, maybe half a mile away, but closing fast through the maze of canyons. Even at that distance, Jed could tell they weren't casual travelers. They rode with the purposeful intensity of hunting wolves, spread out in a formation that spoke of military training and professional experience. When one of them raised field glasses to his eyes and then pointed directly at Yet's position, he knew. He'd been spotted. A shout echoed off the canyon walls, filled with savage triumph and the promise of violence. They'd found what they were looking for. "Time to go, Rustler," Jed whispered, and spurred the horse deeper into the badlands as the sound of pursuit began in earnest behind them. What followed was a nightmare. Chase through some of the most treacherous country west of the Mississippi. The badlands at night were a maze of hidden dangers, sudden drop-offs that could break a horse's legs, narrow passages that ended in sheer walls, loose rock that could trigger avalanches. But Jed had two advantages: Rustler's sure footing on dangerous ground, and his own hard-won knowledge of how to disappear in rough country. He guided Rustler down into a dry creek bed, letting the horse pick his way carefully over the smooth stones. The creek bed wound through the heart of the badlands like a hidden highway, invisible from above, but offering passage through terrain that would challenge even experienced riders. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more distant as they heard. Hunters were forced to navigate the treacherous ground more slowly, but his pursuers were better than good. They knew this country, and they rode with the desperate intensity of men who couldn't afford to let their quarry escape. A rifle shot cracked through the night air, and a bullet whined off a rock near Rustler's hooves, sending sparks flying in the darkness. Then another shot, closer this time, close enough that Jed could hear the wind of its passage. The chase led them through a landscape that seemed designed by the devil himself. Towering rock formations cast deep shadows that could hide an army, while narrow canyons echoed with the sounds of hoofbeats and gunfire, until it was impossible to tell which direction the danger was coming from. More than once, Jed found himself trapped in dead-end canyons, forced to backtrack while his pursuers closed the distance. Rustler proved his worth during those terrifying hours, leaping dry washes and scrambling up steep banks with the agility of a mountain goat. The horse's intelligence showed in the way he picked his footing, never putting a hoof wrong despite the darkness and the treacherous terrain. But their pursuers were riding fresh horses, and slowly, inevitably, they began to close the distance dot as dawn broke gray and cold over the wilderness. Jed found himself in increasingly open country where his advantages began to disappear. The rolling hills were covered with sagebrush and scattered rocks, offering little concealment from men who could see for miles in every direction. His pursuers could see him clearly now, and their fresher horses began to tell Dot another rifle. Shot echoed across the hills, and this time the bullet tugged at Yet's hat, passing close enough to part his hair. He was maybe 50 yards ahead now, close enough to hear their horses breathing hard and the creak of saddle leather, close enough to be dead if one of them got lucky with a shot. A silver key seemed to burn against his leg through his pants pocket, a constant reminder of why these men wanted him dead. He'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was about blood money, stolen gold, and 15 years of secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. Ahead, Jed saw what looked like salvation, a line of cottonwood trees marking the course of a river. If he could reach the water, he might be able to lose them in the brush along the banks, or at least find some kind of defensible position where he could make a stand. Rustler seemed to sense the urgency. The horse found another gear, stretching out in a full gallop that ate up the remaining distance to the trees. They crashed through the first line of brush, just as another rifle shot split the morning air behind them, the bullet clipping branches over their heads. But instead of the deep, swift-running river Jed had hoped for, he found himself looking at a broad, shallow stream, ankle-deep water running over sand and pebbles. No place to hide, and no way to cover his tracks in the soft mud along the banks. His pursuers would be on him in seconds, and this time there would be nowhere left to run. That's when he saw the smoke rising from a campfire upstream, and made a desperate decision that would change everything. A thin column of gray smoke was rising from the trees maybe half a mile away, barely visible in the morning mist. Someone had a fire going, which meant there were other people nearby. Maybe travelers who would help, or at least witness whatever happened next. Even hardened outlaws thought twice about killing in front of witnesses. Jed turned Rustler upstream and kicked him into a splashing run through the shallow water. Behind him, he could hear his pursuers crashing through the brush at the river's edge, their horses snorting and blowing from the long chase. Voices called back and forth harsh, professional voices coordinating an attack knot as he rounded a bend in the stream. Jed saw the source of the smoke, a small camp tucked into a grove of cottonwoods on the far bank. A single horse was picketed nearby, and he could make out the figure of someone crouched beside a small fire, apparently cooking breakfast. "Help!" Jed shouted as he urged Rustler across the stream, water flying from the horse's hooves. "Men with guns! They're trying to kill me." The figure by the fire looked up, and Jed got his first good look at her. She was young, maybe 25 with dark hair pulled back under a worn hat and clothes that had seen hard travel. But what struck him most were her eyes, intelligent, alert, and completely unafraid, despite the obvious danger bearing down on them. "How many?" she asked calmly, already reaching for a rifle that had been leaning against a nearby tree. "3, maybe 4, Jed gasped as he pulled Rustler to a stop, the horse blowing hard from the long chase. "They've been after me since yesterday, and they mean business." The woman moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of serious experience in dangerous situations. She kicked dirt over her fire, grabbed her saddle with one hand and her rifle with the other, and was mounted on a sleek black mare and ready to ride in less than 30 seconds. "This way," she said, spurring her horse toward higher ground away from the river. "Stay close and keep your head down." Jed followed without question, impressed despite his circumstances by the woman's competence and calm in the face of danger. Her mare was clearly a superior animal, fast, sure-footed, and well-trained. She rode with the skill of someone who'd spent serious time in wild country, someone who knew how to survive where others would die. The sound of horses crashing through the trees behind them confirmed that their pursuers had reached the abandoned campsite. Angry shouts echoed through the forest as the men discovered that their quarry had found help, and the pursuit resumed with even greater intensity. The woman led them up a steep game trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. Her mare took the challenging terrain in stride, and she seemed to know exactly where she was going. Within minutes, they'd put considerable distance between themselves and the men at the river, climbing into country that would be nearly impossible to navigate for anyone unfamiliar with the area. After a hard hour of climbing through pine forests and across rocky ridges, she finally called a halt in a clearing high above the valley. From here, they could see for miles in every direction, including back toward the river, where 3 tiny figures could be seen casting about for their trail, like bloodhounds that had lost the scent. "They'll find our tracks eventually," the woman said, dismounting to let her mare blow. "But it'll take them a while, and by then we'll be long gone." Jed climbed down from Rustler's back, his legs shaky from the long chase and the adrenaline that was still coursing through his system. The horse was lathered with sweat and breathing hard, but his eyes were still bright and alert. Whatever else happened, Rustler had earned his keep during the night's deadly game of cat and mouse. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but I'm grateful for—" "Who were they?" she interrupted, her voice sharp with suspicion. "The men chasing you." "I don't know for sure," Jed said carefully, studying her face for any sign of hidden motives. "But I think they might be connected to black-hearted Bart's gang." Something changed in the woman's expression, a hardening around her eyes that made Jed suddenly aware that she was still holding her rifle, and that he knew nothing about her except that she'd helped him escape 3 armed men. For all he knew, she could be working with them, leading him into an even deadlier trap. "And why would Bart's men be chasing you?" she asked, her finger noticeably close to the trigger. Jed found himself caught between gratitude and suspicion. She'd just saved his life, but the frontier was full of people who weren't what they seemed. He decided to tell her part of the truth, but not all of it. "I found a dying man yesterday," he said finally. "He used to ride with Bart's gang. He gave me something before he died, and I think they want it back." "What did he give you?" Jed hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver key. The woman's eyes widened when she saw it, and her grip on the rifle tightened visibly. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told you, from a dying man named Silas Crenshaw. Why? Do you recognize it?" For a long moment, the woman stared at the key without speaking. When she finally looked up at Jed, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "My name is Eleonora Mackenzie," she said slowly, as if the words were being dragged out of her. "And 15 years ago, black-hearted, Bart's gang killed my father." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jed found himself looking down the barrel of her rifle, though she held it low, not quite pointing it at him. The silver key suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hand. "Your father," Jed said slowly, pieces of a deadly puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Was he Thomas Mackenzie?" Eleonora's eyes widened in surprise, and something that might have been hope. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Silas Crenshaw's last words were about him. He said your father was a railroad guard, a good man just doing his job. He asked me to make sure you got something if I found the gold." The rifle in her hands wavered, and for a moment Jed thought she might break down completely. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and cold as winter steel. "My father was guarding a Union Pacific gold shipment bound for Denver. The train was hit outside Hays City on a Tuesday morning in September of 1871. Pay was shot 3 times trying to protect that gold. He lived long enough to tell the sheriff it was Bart's gang, but he died 2 days later from his wounds." She paused, and when she continued, there was a hardness in her voice that spoke of years of pain and careful planning. "I was 12 years old when it happened. We had nothing after Pay died, no money, no family to take us in. The railroad gave us a small pension, but it wasn't enough. My mother worked herself to death trying to keep us fed, taking in washing and sewing, cleaning houses for the wealthy folks in town. She was in the ground before my 15th birthday, worn out by grief and poverty." Eleonora's voice grew colder with each word, and Jed could see the steel that had been forged in the fires of loss and hardship. "I've spent the last 10 years learning everything I could about the men who killed my father. I know their names, their faces, where they like to drink and gamble and spend their money. I've been hunting them, one by one, waiting for my chance at Bart himself. And now you think the key is your chance?" "I know it is." Eleonora finally lowered her rifle completely, but her eyes never left Yet's face. "5 years ago, I tracked down a man named Dutch Henley, who used to ride with Bart. He was dying of consumption in a charity hospital in Kansas City, and he was willing to talk. He told me about the gold shipment, how they'd hidden it away instead of spending it right. Away like they usually did." She moved closer, and Jed could see the intensity burning in her eyes like a fever. "Dutch said they were smart about it, knew that spending that much gold all at once would bring too much attention from the law. So they buried it somewhere, made a map, and agreed to wait until things cooled down. But he said only 2 men knew. Where it was hidden, Bart himself and a man named Silas Crenshaw." The implications hit Jed like a thunderbolt. So when Crenshaw tried to leave the gang... Bart couldn't let him go. Not when he was the only other person who knew where $200,000 was buried. She looked at the key with something. approaching hunger. Dutch said they'd made some kind of map, divided it up so that neither man could find the gold without the other. If Crenshaw gave you that key, it means he found a way to get his half of whatever they set up. He said something about the Eagle's Perch in Abilene, and that the widow holds the map? Eleonora nodded grimly. That's got to be it. Abilene's where they fenced most of their stolen goods back in the day. Bart had connections there, crooked merchants who'd buy anything, no questions asked. If they hid part of their map there, it would make sense. Jed studied her face, trying to read her intentions. She was clearly intelligent and determined, but she was also driven by 15 years of grief and anger. That made her dangerous, but it also made her potentially useful. So what happens now? He asked. We both want to find this gold, but for different reasons. Do we? Eleonora's eyes were sharp and challenging. What do you want with stolen money, mister? Morrison. Jed Morrison. And I want what any man wants: a chance to stop drifting, to build something permanent. A ranch, maybe. A place to call home, built on blood money. Built on money that's been sitting buried for 15 years, doing nobody any good. Your father's still dead, whether that gold stays buried or not. But if we find it, at least his sacrifice won't have been for nothing. Eleonora was quiet for a long moment, and Jed could see her weighing options in her mind. She was clearly a woman who thought before she acted, who planned her moves carefully. There's something else you should know, she said finally. I'm not just hunting Bart's gang for revenge. There's a federal marshal named Sam Wheeler who's been trying to bring them in for years. He's offered a standing reward of $5,000 for information leading to Bart's capture, dead or alive. $5,000 is a lot of money, but it's not $200,000. No, but it's legal money. Money I can collect without worrying about who else might come looking for it later. She shouldered her rifle and moved toward her horse. But you're right about one thing: my father's still dead either way. And if there's a chance that Key can lead me to the men who killed him, I'm willing to take that chance. So we work together? For now. But understand something, Mr. Morrison. If it comes down to a choice between the gold and bringing my father's killers to justice, I choose justice every time. Jed nodded slowly. It wasn't the partnership he would have chosen, but it was better than trying to navigate this maze alone. And if he was being honest with himself, there was something about Eleonora Mackenzie that he found compelling. She had the kind of steel in her spine that he'd rarely encountered, and despite her youth, she'd obviously survived some hard years through intelligence and determination. All right then, he said, extending his hand. Partners. She shook it, her grip firm and calloused from years of hard work. Partners. Now let's get moving. Those men down there won't spend all day looking for our trail, and we need to be well away from here before they decide to give up and head back to report to Bart. They broke camp quickly and efficiently, working together with the easy coordination of experienced travelers. As they prepared to ride out, Jed found himself watching the way Eleonora handled her equipment, every movement precise and purposeful. Nothing wasted. This was clearly a woman who'd learned to survive in dangerous country. How long have you been tracking Bart's gang? He asked as they mounted up. 10 years, off and on. I worked as a seamstress in Kansas City for a while, saved up enough money to buy decent equipment and learn to shoot properly. Then I started following leads, talking to people, putting together a picture of how they operated. That's a long time to carry that kind of anger. It's not anger anymore, she said, checking the load in her rifle with practiced efficiency. Anger burns hot and fast, and then it burns out. This is something colder, more patient. Justice takes time. They rode through the morning in companionable silence, following game trails and hidden paths that took them steadily southeast toward Abilene. Eleonora knew the country well, leading them through terrain that would be almost impossible to track while still making good time toward their destination. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, from the broken badlands where Jed had found Silas Crenshaw to rolling hills covered with grass and scattered stands of oak and hickory. It was better country, more settled, with occasional farms and homesteads tucked into the valleys. But they avoided the main roads, sticking to lesser trails that wound through the countryside like forgotten memories docked by midday. They'd covered nearly 20 miles and put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers. They stopped to rest the horses and eat a cold meal from Eleonora's supplies, sitting in the shade of a wind-carved rock formation that offered a good view of the surrounding country. "Tell me more about this key," Eleonora said, studying it in the afternoon light. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" Jed shook his head, turning the strange object over in his hands. "It's not like any key I've ever come across. The silver alone must be worth something, and that craftsmanship ... Whoever made this was a real artist. Dutch Henley mentioned something about the map being hidden in a special place, somewhere only the key would open. He said Bart and Crenshaw were real clever about it. They didn't want to take any chances on someone stumbling across their fortune by accident. So we get to Abilene, find this widow, and hope she knows what the Eagle's Perch means. And hope Bart's men don't get there first." Eleonora's expression was grim as she looked back the way they'd come. "They're probably riding hard for Abilene right now, figuring that's where you'll head. We may not have as much time as we think." That thought sobered them both, and they finished their meal in silence before pushing on. The afternoon brought them into more settled country, with roads and fences and the occasional town visible in the distance. They had to be more careful now, avoiding places where they might be seen and remembered. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they crested a ridge and saw their destination spread out in the valley below them. Abilene was a sprawling boom town, grown fat on cattle drives and railroad money. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and even at this distance they could hear the sounds of a busy community, the whistle of locomotives, the lowing of cattle in the holding pens, the general hum of commerce and human activity. "There it is," Eleonora said, reining in her mare. "Now comes the hard part. Finding the widow? Finding her before Bart's men do, and staying alive long enough to figure out what that key opens." As they rode down toward the town, Jed found himself thinking about Silas Crenshaw's last words. The Eagle's Perch. The widow holds the map. Somewhere in that sprawling town below them was the answer to a mystery that had been 15 years in the making. The question was whether they'd live long enough to solve it. Abilene after dark was a symphony of vice and violence, a frontier town where fortunes were made and lost with equal speed. The main street blazed with light from saloons, gambling, halls, and hotels, while the air thrummed with piano music, drunken laughter, and the occasional gunshot that reminded everyone that civilization here was still a thin veneer over the raw realities of frontier life. For Jed and Eleonora, creeping through the shadows on the outskirts of town, the bright lights and loud music offered both concealment and danger. They'd ridden hard for 3 days to reach the cattle town, staying off main roads and sleeping in hidden camps, always watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. Behind them, they knew Bart's men were following, patient, relentless, and getting closer with each passing hour. The silver key seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in Yet's pocket, a constant reminder that every step toward the hidden fortune was also a step closer to a grave. They'd agreed to approach the town carefully, splitting up to avoid attention and gathering information separately, before attempting to contact the mysterious widow who supposedly held the map. "The Eagle's Perch has got to be some kind of landmark," Jed said as they studied the town from the cover of a grove of cottonwood trees. "Something visible, something people would recognize. In a town like this, it could be anything, Eleonora replied. A building, a sign, maybe even a natural formation. The saloon across the street, the gilded cage, was the loudest and brightest, spilling yellow light and the tinny sound of a poorly tuned piano onto the muddy thoroughfare. Jed pointed, his chin toward it. If Bart's men are in town, that's where they'll start. It's the biggest watering hole. And the biggest fishbowl, Eleonora countered, her voice low. Too many eyes. Bart is cautious. He'll have his men spread out, watching the livery, the hotels, the freight office. We need to find the eagle's perch before they find us. They tethered their horses in a darkened alley between the general store and the assayer's office, giving Rustler a reassuring pat on the neck. The horse nickered softly, his intelligent eyes scanning the street with a wary alertness that mirrored Yet's own. They agreed to separate. Jed would check the saloons and hotels, looking for a landmark that fit the name, while Eleonora would inquire at the town clerks and land offices, looking for any official record. They would meet back at the alley in 1 hour. The inside of the gilded cage was a wall of noise, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Jed moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who'd seen 100 such places. He scanned the faces cowboys flush with trail pay, grim-faced gamblers, weary prospectors, and the hard-eyed men who preyed on all of them. He saw 2 men near the bar who had the same ruthless look as the riders who chased him, but he couldn't be sure. He ordered a beer, his back to the wall, listening more than looking. The chatter was of cattle prices, land claims, and a recent stagecoach robbery, nothing about eagles or widows. 40 minutes later, nursing the same warm beer, he knew this wasn't the place. As he slipped back out into the night, he saw it. Looming over the smaller, single-story buildings of the main street was the newly constructed Abilene Grand Hotel. It was 3 stories tall, the grandest structure in town, and carved into the ornate wooden facade just below the roofline was a massive, spread-winged eagle. The eagle's perch. It had to be. He found Eleonora already waiting in the alley, her face grim in the moonlight. Nothing at the land office, she reported, but the town clerk mentioned the new hotel has a post office substation in its lobby, for the convenience of its wealthy guests. The pieces clicked into place. The hotel was the eagle's perch. The post office was where the map was held. But what about the widow? Let's move, Jed said. If we're right, Bart's men won't be far behind. The lobby of the Abilene Grand was a world away from the mud and squalor of the street. Plush red carpets, crystal chandeliers, and polished mahogany spoke of money and influence. At the far end, behind a gilded grill, was the post office substation. A prim, severe-looking woman with gray hair, pulled into a tight bun, presided over the counter dot as they approached. Eleonora whispered, "The postmistress. Her name is Martha Gable. Her husband was a known fence for stolen goods before he was shot in a card game 5 years ago. Around town, they still call her Gable's widow." It all fit. The widow, the hotel, the post office. Yet's heart hammered against his ribs. He stepped up to the counter, the silver key heavy in his hand. "Evening, Mom," he said politely. "I'm here to check a box." The eagle's perch. Mrs. Gable's eyes, cold and disinterested, flickered down to the key in his hand and then shot back up to his face, a new alertness in them. "That box has been empty for 15 years, mister. Silas Crenshaw sent me," Jed said, keeping his voice low. The woman's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered her posture. She glanced nervously toward the hotel lobby. He was supposed to come himself. He had a signal. Eleonora stepped forward, pulling something from her saddlebag, a small, withered, and perfectly preserved black flower. She laid it on the counter. Is this the signal? Mrs. Gable gasped, her composure finally breaking. She recognized the black widow flower. Yes, she whispered, her eyes wide. Wait here. She disappeared into a back room. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Jed could feel the eyes of the hotel guests on them, could hear the laughter from the saloon down the street, and imagined Bart's men closing in. Mrs. Gable returned, not with a map, but with a small, flat package wrapped in oilcloth. Box number 1, she said, her voice trembling. The highest one. The eagle's perch. Jed slid the silver key into the lock of the designated box. It turned with a satisfying, well-oiled click. He pulled out the contents, a folded, yellowed deed to a seemingly worthless plot of land in the mountains, and nothing else. This is it, Jed said, bewildered. A deed? Suddenly, the front doors of the hotel burst open. 3 of Bart's men strode in, their leader a scarred brute Jed recognized from the chase. They spotted Jed and Eleonora at the counter and drew their guns. The key, Morrison, the man snarled. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let the lady live. There was no time to think. Eleonora kicked over a heavy brass spittoon, sending it clattering across the marble floor. As the outlaws flinched at the noise, she drew her own revolver and fired, not to kill, but to create chaos. Her bullet shattered a large crystal lamp, plunging their end of the lobby into semi-darkness. Jed grabbed the deed and Eleonora's arm, pulling her toward a side door marked staff. They burst through it into a narrow corridor, the sound of gunshots and shouting echoing behind them. They sprinted down the hallway, found a back exit, and spilled out into the alleyway where their horses were waiting. They know, Eleonora said as she swung into her saddle. We need to ride. They galloped out of the alley and into the labyrinth of Abilene's side streets, leaving the chaos of the Abilene Grand behind. They didn't stop until they were miles out of town, hidden in a deep ravine where they could finally catch their breath and examine the deed under the moonlight. It has to be the map, Eleonora insisted, tracing the lines on the old document. The property lines, they don't match any standard survey. She pulled out a proper map of the territory from her saddlebag. Silas was clever. He disguised the map as a legal document. She overlaid the deed onto the larger map. The strange angles and measurements of the property lines on the deed now corresponded perfectly with specific landmarks on the territorial. Map a distinct peak, a winding river, a trio of rock spires. Together, they formed a clear trail leading deep into the treacherous San Juan Mountains, to a region marked on the map with a single ominous name, the Serpent's Maw. Their journey over the next week was a testament to their endurance and skill. They rode through dense forests and navigated high mountain passes, with Bart's gang never far behind. The pursuit forced them into a seamless partnership. Yet's knowledge of tracking and survival, honed in the cavalry, kept them one step ahead, while Eleonora's meticulous planning and sharpshooting skills got them out of more than one tight spot. The bond between them, forged in shared danger, grew stronger with each passing day. Finally, they reached their destination. The Serpent's Maw was a narrow canyon ending in a massive waterfall that cascaded into a deep turquoise pool. Behind, the veil of water, half hidden by mist, was the dark opening of a cave. This is it, Jed breathed, the roar of the waterfall filling the air. They dismounted, securing the horses in a hidden alcove. As they prepared to enter the cave, Rustler suddenly snorted and stamped his foot, his ears swiveling toward the canyon rim above them. Ambush, Eleonora whispered, her rifle already at her shoulder dot. It was too late. Gunshots erupted from the cliffs above as Bart and his remaining men opened fire. They were trapped. The cave, Jed shouted, pulling Eleonora toward the waterfall. They plunged through the cold, crashing water and into the darkness behind it, emerging in the mouth of a massive cavern. The cave was a natural wonder, its ceiling glittering with crystals. But their eyes were drawn to the far wall, where 6 heavy, iron-banded chests were stacked precariously on a rock ledge above a deep, fast-moving underground river. The treasure. Footsteps echoed from the cave entrance. Bart and his men entered, their figures silhouetted against the bright spray of the waterfall. Nowhere left to run. Bart called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Give me my gold, and I'll give you a quick death." "The gold isn't yours, Bart." Eleonora shouted back, her voice ringing with defiance. "It belongs to the railroad, and you belong at the end of a rope." The gunfight began, the cavern erupting in a deafening roar of ricocheting bullets and flashing light. Jed and Eleonora used the stalagmites for cover, their shots carefully aimed. But they were outnumbered. "We can't hold them off forever," Jed yelled over the din. He looked from the stacked chests to the river below them. An idea, born of desperation, took hold. "The gold. Help me with the gold." Eleonora understood instantly. While she provided covering fire, Jed scrambled up the rocks toward the ledge. A bullet grazed his arm, but he ignored the pain. He reached the chests and put his shoulder against the bottom one. It was incredibly heavy. "Jed, now!" Eleonora cried. As the outlaws advanced with a final desperate heave, Jed pushed the chest. It teetered for a moment, then crashed down, striking the others in a domino effect. The immense weight of 6 chests filled with gold coins hit the rock ledge like a battering ram. The ledge, already unstable, fractured and gave way. Tons of rock and a king's ransom in gold plunged into the narrow channel of the underground river below. The effect was instantaneous. The river, blocked by the massive debris dam, swelled and backed up. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then, with an earth-shattering roar, the water burst through the makeshift dam, surging through the cavern in a flash flood. Waves swept away 3 of Bart's men, their screens swallowed by the torrent. Bart, caught on higher ground, stared in disbelief as his fortune became the instrument of his defeat. Enraged, he charged toward Jed, firing his revolver wildly. Jed met his charge, and the 2 men crashed to the cavern floor, locked in a brutal fight. It ended when Eleonora, with cold precision, shot the gun from Bart's hand, shattering his wrist. The aftermath was quiet, save for the rush of the now receding river. Bart and his remaining men were captured, their spirits broken. Justice, after 15 long years, had been served. They handed the outlaws over to the federal marshals in the next territory. The Union Pacific Railroad, overjoyed at the recovery of its legendary lost fortune, paid out the full $5,000 reward, standing on a sun-drenched hill overlooking a lush valley in Colorado a month later. Jed held out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "Your half," he said to Eleonora. She smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed her face. "I have a better idea. That reward is enough to buy this whole valley. My father believed in building things, not just getting revenge. Let's build something here, together." Jed looked at her, then at Rustler grazing peacefully nearby, and then at the endless expanse of land that stretched before them. The drifter who had entered the badlands with nothing but an old horse and a weary heart was gone. In his place stood a man who had found not just a fortune, but a home. "I reckon I'd like that," Jed Morrison said. "Partners."